Tonight, we revisit 3 cases that once unsettled entire communities, and then slowly slipped into the background of history. 3 young women, 3 investigations, and 3 files that officially closed, yet never fully settled. Madeleine Webb. Today we are looking at a case from the 20th century, so sit back as we travel to the United States. Madeleine Webb was born on June 3, 1912, in Stillwater, Oklahoma. She was an only child, raised in a comfortable household where her father provided steady financial support. By all available accounts, her early life was stable, structured, and free from hardship. From a young age, Madeleine showed a natural inclination toward performance. She enjoyed reading aloud and singing in public, often in front of small groups. At school, she participated in the Glee Club and demonstrated a noticeable ease on stage. Teachers and classmates observed that she was confident when speaking or performing, able to hold attention without effort. Her acting ability in particular stood out. Madeleine was frequently cast in school productions where her presence and delivery distinguished her from other students. One teacher later described her as the most talented student they had ever taught. The remark was not made casually. It reflected a belief that Madeleine possessed genuine promise. There is no indication during these years of behavioral trouble or instability. She was regarded as bright, capable, and ambitious. Expectations around her future were optimistic, shaped by encouragement rather than concern. By the time Madeleine completed her schooling, she carried with her a strong sense of possibility. She had talent, confidence, and the belief that a larger life awaited beyond Stillwater. At this stage, nothing in her record suggested the direction her life would eventually take. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. In 1930, Madeleine Webb's circumstances changed abruptly. Her father died that year, removing the central source of stability and turn, her life. With his death came an immediate financial shift. The security that had defined Madeleine's childhood could no longer be maintained. Her mother was unable to support the household at the same level. While there is no record of sudden poverty, the change was noticeable. Resources were limited, expectations adjusted, and the sense of certainty that had once surrounded Madeleine began to erode. Emotional strain accompanied the financial pressure, even if it was not openly acknowledged. Despite these changes, Madeleine continued forward. She completed her education and graduated in 1933, a milestone that suggested determination and self-reliance. Yet beneath that progress, the foundation of her earlier life had already begun to fracture. Around this period, Madeleine made a sudden personal decision. She eloped with a man named Edie Roy King. The marriage was brief and quickly deteriorated. Details of the relationship remain limited, but its duration was short enough to suggest instability rather than permanence. Not long after, Madeleine herself filed for divorce. The marriage, like the life she had known before her father's death, ended without lasting resolution. What remained was independence, but without clear direction. Madeleine was no longer sheltered by family structure or long-term plans. By the end of this period, she stood alone, divorced, financially uncertain, and searching for a path forward, with fewer anchors than she had known before. Following her divorce, Madeleine Webb focused increasingly on the ambition that had shaped her early confidence. She wanted to become an actress and a model, believing that her talent and experience on stage could lead to professional success. This goal placed her in direct conflict with her mother, who hoped she would remain in Stillwater and pursue a more stable life. Madeleine believed her father would have supported her decision. His encouragement during her school years had reinforced her sense of potential, and without him she felt fewer reasons to remain where her prospects seemed limited. The disagreement ended with Madeleine choosing to leave. In 1936, she moved to Hollywood. The decision represented both opportunity and risk. For nearly 3 years, she attempted to establish herself in the entertainment industry. She found occasional modeling work, enough to sustain her temporarily, but acting roles did not follow. Auditions came and went without results, and no significant breakthrough arrived. By the end of that period, Hollywood had offered little beyond uncertainty. Madeleine left California and relocated to New York City, turning her attention toward Broadway. Once again, she pursued acting while taking work as a waitress to cover daily expenses. The pattern repeated itself. Employment outside the theater paid the bills, but professional progress remained elusive. As time passed, the distance between her aspirations and her circumstances grew. Madeleine was approaching 30, an age when success in the performing world often narrowed rather than expanded. She missed home, yet did not return. Stillwater represented safety, but also the life she had chosen to leave behind. Instead, she remained in New York, determined but isolated, supported by temporary work, and still convinced that opportunity might arrive if she held on long enough. Around this time, Madeleine Webb met a man whose circumstances closely reflected her own. His name was Eli Schonbrun. Eli had once pursued a career in performance. He worked as a big band singer and appeared in cabarets, earning modest recognition before his opportunities began to disappear. As venues closed and work declined, his prospects in entertainment faded. What remained was UNC, a tiny and a growing need for income. Eventually, Eli found employment through his uncle, Murray Herschel, who operated a jewelry business. The business carried a poor reputation, and Eli's involvement did little to improve his stability. He was later arrested, further limiting his options. His personal life followed a similar pattern. Eli had been married, but the relationship ended, leaving him separated and without reliable support. By the time he met Madeleine, Eli was unemployed and struggling. The ambitions that had once driven him had given way to survival. Madeleine, facing her own disappointments in New York, found familiarity in his experiences. Their backgrounds differed, but their trajectories had begun to converge. They formed a relationship rooted in shared frustration and dwindling opportunity. Both had chased careers in performance. Both had fallen short of the futures they envisioned. Financial pressure weighed heavily on them, and stability remained out of reach. Together, they represented two parallel lives moving in the same direction, no longer defined by promise, but by limitation. As their circumstances narrowed, the choices available to them began to narrow as well. By this stage, Madeleine Webb and Eli Schonbrun were no longer living with any sense of stability. Neither had steady work. Money was scarce, and permanent housing was out of reach. Their circumstances forced them into a transient existence, moving frequently from one hotel to another across New York. This pattern soon developed into a routine. They checked in, stayed briefly, and then left without paying. What may have begun as temporary necessity gradually became habitual. Each departure, without settling a bill, reduced the boundary between desperation and deception. One such stay took place at the Sutton Hotel. There, Eli and Madeleine registered under false names, identifying themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Leopold. The decision was deliberate. It provided distance from their real identities and allowed them to continue moving without consequence, at least temporarily. Eli reinforced the deception through his appearance and behavior. He wore a diamond ring and claimed to be recently divorced. To hotel staff and others they encountered, he introduced Madeleine as his bride. The presentation was confident and practiced, designed to avoid suspicion. Madeleine accepted the story. There is no record of her challenging Eli's claims or questioning the arrangement. Whether out of trust or necessity, she participated in the shared identity they presented to the outside world. At this point, survival depended less on opportunity and more on persuasion. Their ability to move forward relied on being believed. Deception was no longer incidental. It had become part of how they lived and how they planned to continue. As Madeleine Webb and Eli Schonbrun's situation continued to deteriorate, another figure entered their lives. His name was John Cullen. John was known to police as a petty criminal, someone who had spent considerable time in trouble with the law. His familiarity with illegal activity distinguished him from Madeleine and Eli, whose deceptions had so far been limited to survival. Where they improvised, John had experience. The broader environment offered little relief. Economic hardship was widespread, and the effects of World War II had begun to alter daily life in New York. Nightclubs and entertainment venues saw fewer visitors, further reducing opportunities for performers and those dependent on that economy. Work became harder to find, and desperation deepened. Eli, already struggling with unemployment and mounting pressure, grew increasingly anxious. In conversations with John, the tone shifted. What had once been about getting by turned into discussions of robbery. The idea was no longer simply to avoid payment or use false names, but to obtain money directly. These discussions marked a significant change. Crime was no longer reared, selective or temporary. It was being considered deliberately, with intent and planning. John's presence reinforced the shift, offering both familiarity with criminal behavior and a sense of shared purpose. By this point, the boundaries had moved. The possibility of robbery was no longer theoretical. It had become a calculated option, one shaped by circumstance, reinforced by association, and no longer dismissed as unthinkable. The focus of the plan soon narrowed to a single individual. Her name was Susan Reich. Susan Reich was 52 years old, and known within New York's theater circles as a patron of the arts. She moved comfortably within cultural and social spaces that Madeleine Webb and Eli Schönbrunn could no longer access. Her background stood in sharp contrast to their circumstances. Susan was the daughter of a wealthy Polish industrialist. She arrived in New York on September 5, 1939, just 4 days after the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Her arrival placed her among those who had escaped a continent descending into conflict, carrying both privilege and displacement into her new surroundings. In New York, Susan became visible in society, attending performances and maintaining connections within artistic circles. To Eli, she appeared not only approachable but prosperous. Among the people he encountered, she stood out as someone who could provide financial relief through robbery. There is no indication that Susan was aware of any risk. She moved through the city without suspicion, her interactions shaped by routine and familiarity rather than caution. She was known, trusted, and unguarded. As Eli identified her as a potential target, the planning reached a point of focus. The decision was made quietly, without confrontation or warning. At this stage, nothing about Susan's daily life had changed. The plan existed only among those who intended to carry it out. She remained unaware that her presence had already been converted into opportunity by others. The plan moved forward through an ordinary social gesture. A telephone call was placed to Susan Reich's residence. The call was answered by her aunt, Eliza. The woman on the line identified herself as Madeleine Webb. She described herself as a recently married actress and spoke with familiarity and ease. The reason for the call was presented simply. Madeleine invited Susan to join her for lunch at the Sutton Hotel. There was nothing unusual about the request. The tone was polite, social, and unremarkable. No urgency was suggested, and no suspicion was raised. Susan accepted the invitation. At the arranged time, she left to meet the caller. She did so without hesitation, treating the lunch as a routine engagement, rather than a departure that required caution or concern. There is no indication that she alerted anyone or expressed doubt about the meeting. After leaving her residence, Susan Reich did not return. Hours passed without explanation. Then more time followed. What had begun as a simple lunch arrangement produced no further contact, no message, and no confirmation that the meeting had ended as expected. This was the final moment in which Susan's movements appeared ordinary and predictable. After this point, she vanished from public view, and the invitation ceased to be a social detail. When Susan Reich failed to return, concern gradually replaced routine. After 2 days without contact, her husband reported her missing. Only then did police become involved. Officers began by tracing Susan's last known plans. The lunch invitation at the Sutton Hotel quickly emerged as the final confirmed destination. Investigators proceeded to the hotel to determine whether she had arrived, and if so, what had followed. Inside the Sutton Hotel, police made a discovery that immediately altered the course of the case. Susan Reich was found dead. The condition of her body was recorded as Ed at the scene. Her hands were bound, her mouth had been taped shut. A scarf was tied around her neck. There was no indication of a struggle extending beyond the room, and no evidence that she had left the hotel after arriving. Several personal items were missing. Susan's diamond ring was gone, as was her wristwatch. Their absence suggested robbery and introduced motive alongside violence. At this point, uncertainty ended. The missing person report gave way to a confirmed homicide. The quiet disappearance that had followed a simple lunch invitation was replaced by physical evidence and documented facts. What had once been speculation now became a crime scene. The investigation shifted from locating Susan Reich to determining who had brought her to the Sutton Hotel and what had happened once she arrived. With the crime confirmed, the investigation moved quickly into a procedural phase. Detective Thomas Tunney was assigned to lead the case. Tunney and other officers began by interviewing staff at the Sutton Hotel. Employees recalled a couple who had stayed at the hotel under assumed names. Their appearance and behavior were documented, and attention turned to the hotel registry. A review of the records revealed that the room connected to Susan Reich had been registered to Mr. and Mrs. Leopold. The alias was immediately treated as significant. Police began tracing possible links connected to the missing jewelry and the false identities used at the hotel. That effort led investigators to Murray Herschel, a jeweler with known business dealings involving Eli Schonbrunn. Through Herschel, police were able to identify Eli as a likely suspect. Photographs of both Eli and Madeleine Webb were obtained and shown to hotel staff. The identification was immediate. Employees confirmed that the individuals in the photographs were the same couple who had registered under the Leopold name. At that point, the investigation shifted direction. The suspects were no longer unknown. Authorities now knew who they were looking for and where to begin the search. Police located Madeleine Webb and Eli Schonbrunn at a hotel in the Bronx. During the arrest, officers found jewelry belonging to Susan Reich in their possession. The discovery connected them directly to the crime scene at the Sutton Hotel. John Cullen was arrested shortly afterward. All three were questioned separately. Madeleine denied any knowledge of the robbery or the murder. She stated that she had not been involved and claimed she was unaware of what had taken place. Eli and John supported her account, insisting that Madeleine knew nothing about the crime and had played no role in planning or carrying it out. Investigators remained unconvinced. Madeleine's education and background led police to doubt that she was uninvolved or unaware. Despite the conflicting statements, the evidence gathered was considered sufficient to proceed. Madeleine Webb, Eli Schonbrunn, and John Cullen were each formally charged with murder. As the case moved toward trial, denial and doubt existed side by side, with no version of events fully accepted or dismissed. The trial drew immediate public attention. Newspapers followed the proceedings closely, and Madeleine Webb became the central focus of coverage. Her background, appearance, and demeanor were examined in detail, turning the courtroom into a public spectacle. At the center of the case was a dispute over the telephone call that brought Susan Reich to the Sutton Hotel. Murray Herschel testified that Madeleine had placed the call. Susan's aunt, Eliza, supported the claim, stating that the caller's voice matched Madeleine's. Madeleine denied making the call or arranging the meeting. Eli Schonbrunn and John Cullen offered a different account. Both accused Murray Herschel of placing the call himself, claiming he could imitate a woman's voice. Eli further testified that Madeleine was not present at the hotel during the crime. During his testimony, Madeleine became visibly distressed and shouted at the prosecution, drawing attention to her emotional state. The prosecution later conceded that she had not been present during the killing, but argued that she was still responsible through prior knowledge and involvement. Responsibility, they maintained, did not require physical presence. After a prolonged period of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Madeleine Webb, Eli Schönbrunn, and John Cullen were each found guilty. In its decision, the jury recommended mercy for Madeleine. No such recommendation was made for the two men. Judge Jonah Goldstein delivered the sentences. Eli Schönbrunn and John Cullen were condemned to death. Madeleine Webb was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. With the pronouncement, the legal process reached its conclusion. The arguments presented during the trial, conflicting testimony, disputed responsibility, and public speculation were set aside in favor of the court's ruling. The verdict resolved the case in the eyes of the law. Public debate ended not with clarity, but with finality, as the consequences of the judgment moved from the courtroom into permanent record. Following sentencing, Madeleine Webb was transferred to Westfield Women's Prison. Her initial months there were marked by emotional collapse. She was frequently silent and spent long periods crying, struggling to adjust to confinement. Over time, her behavior changed. Madeleine began teaching other inmates to read and write. She worked in the prison library and later directed theatrical productions within the institution. Her conduct drew positive attention from prison officials. Superintendent Lillian Fish described her as sincere, cooperative, and helpful. Eli Schönbrunn and John Cullen were sent to Sing Sing prison. Their sentences moved forward on a separate course. On a P. Real 29, 1943, Eli received a final letter from Madeleine. The letter was destroyed before the execution. Later that day, both Eli Schönbrunn and John Cullen were put to death. The consequences of the verdict unfolded unevenly. For some, time ended abruptly. For others, it continued behind prison walls. For years, Madeleine Webb's requests for parole were denied. The severity of the crime weighed heavily against her release, and repeated appeals failed to change her sentence. In 1967, parole was finally granted. Madeleine returned to Stillwater, Oklahoma, the place where her life had begun. There, she cared for her elderly mother and lived quietly. The legal costs associated with her defense had exhausted what remained of her financial resources, leaving little beyond routine survival. She became involved in community activities, maintaining a low public profile. In October 1979, her mother died. Madeleine Webb died on February 1, 1980. She was 67 years old. The cause of death was cancer. Until the end of her life, she continued to proclaim her innocence in the murder of Susan Reich. No further legal action followed. The case remained as it stood, preserved in court records and testimony. The record closed without resolution. Amy Gregory. In the early hours of 21st February 1895, a small body was found in Old Deer Park, Richmond. It lay out in the open, exposed to the winter cold, in a part of the park where few would have expected to find anything more than frost and silence. The child was an infant girl. She had been left alone through the night. What first drew attention was not only the child herself, but the condition in which she had been found. A white pocket handkerchief had been tied tightly around her neck. There was no uncertainty about the seriousness of the scene. This was not treated as a natural death, nor as an accident. From the moment the body was examined, the case moved at once into the hands of the police as a suspected killing. Richmond, by then, was no stranger to hardship, but the death of a child in so public a place carried a special weight. An infant abandoned in a park was shocking enough. An infant found with a ligature around the neck turned that shock into something colder and more official. The discovery demanded identification, explanation, and an answer to the most immediate question of all: who had left her there? At that stage, the child was still only a body in the record. She had no known history, no confirmed family, no name publicly attached to her. Those details would come later, pulled together through witness statements, police work, and the machinery of the law. For the moment, what the authorities had was simple and devastating. A dead infant, found outdoors in Richmond, and clear signs that her death required investigation. Before the case could move toward an arrest, the police had to establish who the child was. That question, her identity, would lead them to a young woman named Amy Gregory. The woman who would eventually stand before the court in this case appeared in the record under two names. In the official proceedings at the Old Bailey, she was identified as Amy Gregory, alias Smart, a detail that mattered because the child at the center of the case was also recorded under the surname Smart rather than Gregory. That was not a separate person. It was the same woman moving through different parts of her life under different names, and the case could not be understood without that distinction being made clearly. Amy was born in 1872. Later linked prison and criminal history records identify her as Amy Gregory, with Smart listed as her alias, and connect her directly to the March 1895 murder case. Those same linked records place her birth year in 1872, which matches later historical reconstructions of the case. Before the events in Richmond, she had married Frederick James Gregory. By the time the case emerged in 1895, however, that marriage no longer appears in the record as a settled household. Witness evidence later stated that Amy had been living apart from her husband for about 15 months. That separation helps explain why she entered the institutional record under the name Smart, and why, when the child was born, the registration did not immediately reflect the married surname Gregory. That is the essential background, and little more is needed at this stage. The case did not turn on a long account of Amy's childhood or family history. What mattered was the position she occupied in the months before the crime. A 23-year-old married woman, separated from her husband, moving through Richmond in unstable circumstances, and recorded under both her married and birth names. By the time the authorities began trying to identify the dead child found in Old Deer Park, those two names, Gregory and Smart, were already the first clue to the life behind the case. The next step in that record leads not to the courtroom, but to the Richmond workhouse. On the 12th of December 1894, Amy entered the Richmond workhouse. By then she was heavily pregnant, without a settled place to stay, and moving through a system designed less for comfort than for control. In that institutional setting, names mattered. When she was admitted, she did not present herself as a married woman living under the name Gregory. She described herself as single and was entered under the name Amy Smart. That detail would later matter greatly. It explained why the child born there would first appear in the record not as Gregory, but as Smart. Inside the workhouse, the child's life begins in the documents. On 31st December 1894, Amy gave birth to a girl. The baby was later registered as Frances Maud Smart, and for a brief time her existence was recorded in the ordinary language of institutional procedure rather than criminal investigation. Birth, entry, registration, those were the first facts attached to her. At that stage, nothing in the record suggested that the child would soon become the center of a murder case. The workhouse is important not because it offers dramatic detail, but because it fixes the earliest verified setting of both mother and child. It shows where the baby was born, under what name she entered the record, and under what circumstances Amy was living at the end of 1894. The case begins there, in an official environment where poverty was documented with the same precision as birth. It also establishes something else that later became important in public discussion of the case. Evidence given afterwards stated that Amy left the workhouse of her own accord. She had not been turned out. Testimony indicated that she could have remained there if she had chosen to do so. That point would later be used against her, especially when the case moved from local inquiry to courtroom judgment. It suggested that some form of shelter had still been available when she chose to leave it. By late January 1895, Amy was no longer inside the institution. She had taken the child with her back into Richmond, where official protection ended and a far less stable life began. From that point on, the record leaves the workhouse behind and follows Amy into lodgings, short-term arrangements, and the growing problem of how the baby was to be kept. After leaving the Richmond workhouse on the 24th of January 1895, Amy Gregory moved into a far less stable part of the record. The workhouse had provided shelter and the first documented setting of the child's life. Once she left, that structure disappeared. According to the testimony later given in court, She was then trying to find both somewhere to stay and some way to keep herself and the baby fed. One of the key witnesses at this stage was Sarah Burridge of Alexander Road, Richmond. She said Amy came to her looking for a furnished room and described herself as having neither a friend nor a home to go to. Burridge allowed her to stay and, according to the evidence, did so without charge. That detail matters because it shows how close Amy's circumstances had become to complete destitution. She was not moving between secure lodgings. She was relying on informal kindness, temporary shelter, and whatever work she could still obtain. The child was not continuously with her during this period. Another woman, Charlotte Williams, agreed to take the baby and nurse her for 5 shillings a week. Williams said she met Amy at Burridge's house on the 29th of January and took charge of the child under that arrangement, feeding the infant on condensed milk. The agreement, however, depended on regular payment. After about 12 days, Williams had not been paid and returned the baby. In her evidence, she stated that when the child came back to the mother, the baby was still strong and healthy. These details form one of the clearest documented stages in the case. They do not yet answer what would happen later, but they show the conditions in which mother and child were living: borrowed shelter, uncertain employment, and childcare reduced to a weekly cash arrangement that quickly failed. By the time the baby was returned, Amy was again solely responsible for an infant she had little visible means to support. The next part of the record follows the final movements of mother and child together. By the time Amy Gregory reached Raleigh Road in Richmond, the movements of mother and child had become narrower, more temporary, and easier to trace. Anne French, of 25 Raleigh Road, later told the court that Amy came there on the 12th of February 1895, looking for a furnished room. She stayed in the house for about 10 days. That lodging became the last confirmed place where the baby was seen alive in her mother's care. The most important evidence from that final stage concerned the evening of 20th February. Anne French said that at about 8:40 p.m. she heard the baby crying, then being hushed by Amy as she left the house. The child was with her when she went out. Nothing in the surviving record suggests that anyone at the house saw the baby again after that moment. According to French's evidence, Amy returned at about 10:15 p.m., but she came back without the child. When asked where the baby was, she said it had been left with Mrs. Whitrod. The statement gave the immediate impression that the child had simply been placed elsewhere for care. At that point, there was not yet a body, not yet a murder charge, and not yet the full weight of the case that would follow. There was only a young woman returning to her lodging without the infant she had taken out earlier that night. The next morning, the trail moved forward again. On the 22nd of February, another witness, Mary Priest, said Amy appeared with the baby's clothes and repeated that the child was with Mrs. Whitrod at 101 Prince's Road. She handed the clothes over for use by Priest's child. The explanation was still the same. The baby, she said, had been left in someone else's care. But by then, the truth had already entered the record. Before those explanations could go any further, an infant girl had been found dead in Old Deer Park. The medical evidence came first. After the infant's body was taken from Old Deer Park to the police station, it was examined by Dr. Matthew Gardner. His conclusion was direct. The child had died from strangulation. The condition of the body, as later reported in the surviving case record, supported that finding. The handkerchief had been tied tightly around the neck, and the doctor described clear compression marks. He also noted another detail that would remain important throughout the case. The baby was said to be very emaciated, weighing only about 5.5 pounds when examined. That combination of findings shaped the investigation at once. The police were no longer dealing only with the discovery of an unidentified infant in the park. They now had medical evidence of fatal violence, alongside signs of severe physical weakness. The identity of the child had already begun to emerge through witnesses who connected the body to Amy Gregory, and the inquiry moved quickly from the park to the people who had lodged her and seen her with the baby in the days before death. Amy was arrested late on the 24th of February 1895 at Springfield Terrace, Sandicombe Road, Richmond. According to the reported evidence, she at first tried to deny that the child was hers. Then, after the police pressed the point, she asked, "How did you find it out?" and added that she wished she had gone farther away. That statement did not settle the question of how the child had died, but it showed that the inquiry had reached the mother the police were looking for. When formally charged the following day, Amy denied murder. Her explanation entered the record in simple terms. She said the child had died of starvation, that her milk had gone through worry, and that she had no money and no work. Those words did not match the doctor's conclusion, and that contradiction would define the next stage of the case. On his side stood the post-mortem finding of strangulation. On the other stood Amy's insistence that the child had died through hunger and destitution. That conflict now passed from the police into the formal setting of the inquest. The police inquiry now passed into a formal legal setting. On the 1st of March 1895, the inquest into the infant's death was held at the Vestry Hall, Richmond, before the coroner, Braxton Hicks. By that point, the investigation had already moved beyond the question of identity. The child had been connected to Amy Gregory, the medical evidence had been taken, and the circumstances of the last night had begun to form a clear sequence. The inquest's task was not to decide the final punishment, but to determine, in law, how the child had died and whether a criminal charge should follow. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder. That phrase placed the case firmly within the most serious category available to the law. It meant the death would not be treated as misadventure, neglect, or some lesser offence. The coroner's court was satisfied that the child had been unlawfully killed and that the case should move forward on that basis. The inquest, therefore, became the first formal judgment in the record. Not a conviction, but a clear declaration that the death was being treated as murder. Yet the verdict did not end there. The same jury added an unusual and revealing recommendation. They asked that, if the woman were convicted, she should receive the merciful consideration of the court. Some reports also noted that members of the jury agreed to subscribe toward her defense. Those details mattered because they showed that sympathy had already entered the case at the very point where the law was taking its hardest view. The infant's death was condemned in the strongest terms, but the condition of the mother was not ignored. That tension would define everything that followed. The authorities were prepared to call it murder. Even so, from the inquest onward, there were already signs that not everyone believed the case should end in the usual way. The case reached its central legal stage at the Old Bailey in March 1895. The formal record identified the defendant as Amy Gregory, alias Smart, aged 23, and charged her with the willful murder of Frances Maud Smart. That wording matters because it fixed in law both the identity of the accused and the name under which the child was entered into the case. By the time the trial opened, the investigation had already supplied the basic chain of evidence. The infant had been found dead in Old Deer Park, the body had been identified through witnesses, and Amy had been traced as the mother. The prosecution case was built from the same points that had emerged at the inquest. Workhouse nurses gave evidence about the child's birth and about Amy presenting herself there under the name Smart. Witnesses from Richmond lodging houses described her poverty, her difficulty securing stable shelter, and the arrangements made for the baby's care after she left the workhouse. The final movements of mother and child were then placed before the court through testimony that Amy had left her lodging with the infant and later returned without her. Medical evidence completed the sequence, with the child's death attributed to strangulation. The defense position, as reflected in press and later summaries of the case, did not dispute the desperation of Amy's circumstances. Instead, the emphasis fell on poverty, abandonment, and mental distress. Reports described her as weeping in court. Her own account, repeated in substance, was that the child had died of starvation, that she had no money, and that she had not known what to do. That did not answer the medical evidence, but it did shape the way the case was heard. Even the prosecution opening, in some newspaper accounts, acknowledged that the story was a pitiful one. The jury did not acquit her. The Old Bailey record shows that Amy Gregory, alias Smart, was found guilty of the willful murder of Frances Maud Smart, but the verdict was immediately qualified by a recommendation to mercy. Newspaper accounts describe the jury as strongly urging leniency because of the distressed state of her mind at the time of the act. That recommendation was crucial. It did not alter the conviction, but it made clear that the courtroom had reached the same uneasy position already visible at the inquest. The law was prepared to call it murder, yet sympathy for Amy's condition remained impossible to ignore. Sentence would still follow in the usual form, but by the time the jury spoke, the case had already begun to move toward a result more complicated than a straightforward capital ending. After the jury returned its verdict at the Old Bailey, the case moved into the final stage that, in a murder trial of that period, usually led straight to the scaffold. The formal sentence passed on Amy Gregory, alias Smart, was death. The Old Bailey record preserves that outcome in its summary line, guilty, death. But the same record also shows that the sentence did not stand unchanged. Beside that judgment appears the note, respited. In practical terms, the court had delivered the capital sentence in the usual form, but the punishment was not carried out. That change did not happen by accident. The recommendation to mercy made by the jury at trial became part of the wider pressure surrounding the case, and later summaries of the record state that the Home Secretary granted Amy a reprieve. Accounts tied to the Richmond case say that by 11th of April 1895, the death sentence had been conditionally pardoned and commuted to penal servitude for life. Whatever the exact administrative route, the key point is clear in the surviving sources. The law had pronounced death, but the state chose imprisonment instead. From there, the record becomes one of custody rather than execution. Later case summaries state that Amy was first conveyed to Holloway Prison, then to Woking Prison, before serving time at HM Prison Aylesbury. The prison-linked record in digital panopticon connects the same Amy Gregory from the Old Bailey case to a later prison history, and shows that she was granted a prison license on the 28th of February 1899. A further linked entry records her discharge on 23rd March 1899. Those dates matter because they show that although the sentence had originally been one of death, her actual punishment became several years of imprisonment followed by supervised release. So the case did not end at the gallows. The scaffold was avoided, but punishment did not disappear. Amy Gregory left a courtroom under sentence of death and emerged, 4 years later, from the prison system under license. The capital ending had been set aside, yet the record still closed this stage of her life in confinement, transfer, and release under state control. After the Old Bailey case had ended and the death sentence had been set aside, Amy Gregory passed out of the public drama of the courtroom and into the quieter record of the prison system. The clearest surviving trace of that stage comes through the linked prison material preserved by digital panopticon, which connects her directly to the 1895 case and shows that she received a prison license on 28th of February 1899, with her discharge recorded on 23rd of March 1899. Those entries matter because they show, in simple administrative terms, that she did not remain in custody for life. She was released back into society under supervision after several years in prison. Later local history work and linked record material suggest that Amy's life did not end with imprisonment. Reconstructions of the case state that after release, she went to the Oxford House of Refuge, returned to work connected with laundry, and was eventually taken back by her husband. Later census-linked summaries place her again within an ordinary household setting. Those details survive less as dramatic narrative than as fragments of ordinary civil life. Residence, family connection, work, and continued existence beyond the crime that had once placed her under a death sentence. They do not erase the case. They simply show that the woman at its center did not vanish from the record when the prison gate closed behind her. That is part of why the case endured. Amy Gregory's prosecution came at a moment when late Victorian society was increasingly uneasy about how the law treated women accused of killing infants, especially in cases shaped by poverty, abandonment, and social disgrace. Her conviction remained a murder conviction, but the recommendation to mercy, the reprieve, and the later discussion surrounding the case all placed it inside a wider historical argument about punishment, responsibility, and the limits of capital justice. Modern scholarship has continued to cite the case for exactly that reason. In the end, the story survives not because everything about Amy Gregory's life is known, but because enough of it entered the archive to remain visible. The court record endures. The prison traces remain. Later historical discussion kept the case from disappearing completely. Florence Kate Poysden. Dearton Street Farm stood on the outskirts of Tainham, Kent, a working holding defined by its routine rather than its size. Contemporary records describe it as a place of regular agricultural labour, overseen on behalf of its owner and managed day-to-day by George Poysden, who served as the farm's bailiff. His responsibilities placed him at the centre of the property's operations, supervising work, accounts, and the movement of those who lived and laboured there. The Poysden household included George, his wife Anne, and their children. Among them was Florence Kate Poysden, born in 1872 and 15 years old in the summer of 1887. Parish and census records situate her firmly within the domestic rhythm of the farm, where family members assisted with household tasks as required. Nothing in the surviving documentation marks Florence as exceptional or unusual. She appears in the record only as a daughter living at home. The farm also accommodated lodgers. This arrangement was not uncommon in rural Kent, where extra hands were often housed on site to support farm work. Among those lodging at Dearton Street Farm was Charles Walter, who had resided there for nearly 3 years prior to June 1887. Newspaper accounts identify him as both a worker and a lodger, occupying a room within the household rather than separate quarters. Descriptions of the farm in surviving reports emphasize normality. There are no references to disorder, disputes, or irregular conduct within the household. The daily routine proceeded as expected: work in the fields, meals taken in common, and lodging provided to those employed on the farm. If you find value in these stories, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel Forgotten Crimes. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. In early June 1887, Dearton Street Farm was recorded as functioning in its usual manner. A household in Kitchenit, regular order, unaware of what would follow. Among those living at Dearton Street Farm was Charles Walter, a man who occupied a position that placed him inside the household rather than at its margins. Contemporary reports describe him as a lodger and worker, housed under the same roof as the Poysden family. His stay at the farm was not brief. By June 1887, Walter had been resident there for nearly 3 years, a duration that suggests a settled arrangement rather than temporary hire. Accounts in local newspapers present Walter as someone familiar to the household and known within the daily routines of the farm. He worked as required and took his meals on the premises. His lodging placed him in close proximity to the family, with access to the shared domestic spaces typical of rural farmhouses of the period. There is no indication in the surviving record that his presence was regarded as unusual or that his conduct had previously drawn formal concern. What does appear in reporting, however, are references to health complaints in the period leading up to the crime. Walter was described as suffering from illness, sufficient to confine him indoors rather than at work. These reports do not elaborate on the precise nature of his condition, only that it affected his ability to carry out his usual duties and required him to remain in his room. The household's response to this illness followed ordinary custom. Food and medicine were brought to him, and his care was managed within the domestic structure of the farm rather than by outside intervention. Nothing in the record indicates alarm or suspicion attached to this arrangement. On the morning of Wednesday, 8th of June 1887, Charles Walter remained confined to his bed, receiving attention from within the household as the day began. The events of Wednesday, 8th of June 1887, unfolded within the ordinary morning routine of Dearton Street Farm. Contemporary reports place the incident in the earlier part of the day, while household activity was already underway. Charles Walter remained confined to his room, still unwell and unable to leave his bed. As part of the household's usual response to illness, Florence Kate Poysden was sent to attend to him. Records state that she carried medicine to Walter's room, a task consistent with her role within the family and the domestic customs of the time. There is no indication that this visit was treated as unusual or that any concern accompanied it. What followed is documented only through later testimony and reporting. Inside the room, Walter attacked Florence with a razor that he had in his possession. The exact sequence of actions within the room is not preserved in detail, but the outcome was clear and immediate. Florence sustained severe wounds to her throat. Despite her injuries, she managed to leave the room and make her way downstairs. Members of the household later described finding her in the lower part of the house, gravely wounded and bleeding heavily. Assistance was summoned, but the injuries were already fatal. During the same interval, Walter inflicted wounds upon himself using the same instrument. These injuries were serious, but not fatal. When discovered, he was found alive and subsequently placed under restraint until authorities arrived. Medical attention was sought without delay. Florence Kate Poysden, 15 years of age, was attended to as efforts were made to save her life. Those efforts failed. The injuries she had sustained proved beyond remedy. Later that day, Florence Kate Poysden died from her wounds, and the events at Dearton Street Farm passed from private tragedy into official record. The discovery inside Dearton Street Farm was made. Within moments of the attack, members of the household, alerted by the movement and collapse of Florence Kate Poysden, found her in the lower part of the house, severely wounded and bleeding. Contemporary accounts describe her condition as immediately grave. She was conscious only briefly, if at all, and unable to give any sustained account of what had occurred. Attention then turned to Charles Walter. He was found in his room, still alive, suffering from self-inflicted wounds caused by the same razor used in the attack. Although injured, he was not in immediate danger of death. His condition allowed for restraint and supervision while assistance was sought. Medical help was summoned without delay. Local practitioners attended the scene and examined both parties. Their priority was Florence, whose injuries were assessed as fatal. No surgical or medical intervention available at the time was capable of reversing the damage that had been done. News of the incident spread quickly beyond the household. Neighbors and local officials were alerted, and the matter was soon treated as a serious criminal occurrence rather than a domestic emergency. The farm, previously a private working household, became the focus of official attention. Once Florence's death was confirmed, responsibility for the case passed formally to the authorities. Arrangements were made to secure the scene and prevent interference. Statements were taken from those present, and the circumstances of the death were reported through the appropriate channels. Later that day, police took Charles Walter into custody. He was removed from Dearton Street Farm under guard, marking the point at which the events of 8th of June 1887 entered the criminal justice system and the public record. Medical examination of Florence Kate Poysden was conducted shortly after her death, and its findings were entered into the official record. Contemporary reports describe the injuries as severe incised wounds to the throat, consistent with the use of a sharp instrument. The nature of the wounds was such that death would have followed rapidly, even with immediate assistance. The attending medical practitioners reported extensive damage to vital structures of the neck. Blood loss was described as substantial, and the injuries were determined to be necessarily fatal. No evidence was presented of defensive wounds or prolonged struggle beyond what could be inferred from her movement from the upper room to the lower part of the house. The medical opinion was clear and unambiguous as to the cause of death. The same examination process extended to Charles Walter, who remained alive following the incident. His injuries were also caused by a sharp instrument and were self-inflicted. Medical reports described them as serious but not life-threatening. He was considered physically capable of being detained and examined, though still requiring care. These findings were recorded without speculation as to motive or state of mind. The role of the medical evidence was limited to establishing physical facts: the cause of death, the means by which it was inflicted, and the condition of the surviving party. Based on this evidence, Florence Kate Poysden's death was formally classified as the result of violent injury inflicted by another person. The medical conclusions left no uncertainty as to the mechanism of death or its immediacy. From this point forward, the case was treated officially as homicide, and responsibility for its resolution passed fully into the legal system. Following his removal from Dearton Street Farm, Charles Walter was taken into custody and conveyed to Faversham, where he was held pending further examination. His injuries, though serious, were not considered sufficient to prevent detention, and arrangements were made for him to be kept under supervision while the initial legal process began. Within days of the incident, Walter was brought before a local magistrate to answer for the death of Florence Kate Poysden. Contemporary reports identify the presiding magistrate as W.E. Rigdon, acting in his official capacity to determine whether the case should proceed to a higher court. The hearing was procedural in nature. No determination of guilt was sought at this stage, nor was any defense presented. Evidence relating to the death was summarized for the court, including confirmation of Florence's injuries and the circumstances under which Walter had been found. The magistrate's role was limited to assessing whether sufficient grounds existed to commit the accused for trial. Testimony and documentation were treated as preliminary, with fuller examination reserved for the assizes. Walter did not enter a plea during this appearance. The question of his mental or physical condition was not yet formally addressed beyond what was necessary to confirm his capacity to be held in custody. On the basis of the evidence presented, the magistrate ruled that the case met the legal threshold required to proceed. A formal committal order was issued. Charles Walter was remanded in custody and directed to stand trial at the next sitting of the Maidstone Assizes, where the matter would be heard in full before a judge and jury. With that order, the case moved beyond local jurisdiction and into the higher courts. An inquest into the death of Florence Kate Poysden was convened shortly after the events of 8th of June 1887, as required by law. The proceedings were held under the authority of the local coroner, whose task was limited to establishing the facts of the case, death rather than assigning criminal guilt. Witnesses connected to Dearton Street Farm were called to give evidence. Their statements outlined the ordinary condition of the household prior to the incident, Florence's visit to Charles Walter's room with medicine, and her subsequent appearance in the lower part of the house in a gravely injured state. Testimony was confined to direct observation and immediate response. No speculation as to motive or intention was permitted. Medical evidence formed a central part of the inquest record. The attending practitioners described the wounds sustained by Florence, identifying them as deep incised injuries to the throat caused by a sharp instrument. Their testimony confirmed that the injuries were necessarily fatal and that death would have occurred quickly due to blood loss and damage to vital structures. Additional medical evidence was given regarding Walter's self-inflicted injuries, which were again described as serious but not fatal. The coroner reviewed the evidence in its entirety. His role was to ensure that the jury understood the medical facts and the sequence of events as presented, without directing them toward any conclusion beyond what the evidence supported. The question before the jury was narrowly defined: by what means and in what manner Florence Kate Poysden had met her death. After consideration, the jury returned an official verdict consistent with the medical and witness testimony. Florence Kate Poysden was found to have died from wounds inflicted by Charles Walter. With that finding entered into record, the inquest concluded. All material evidence now pointed toward formal proceedings at the Maidstone Assizes, where the case would be taken up by the criminal courts. The case of Regina versus Charles Walter came before the Maidstone Assizes in July 1887, marking the first time the matter was addressed by the higher criminal court. At the formal presentation of the charge relating to the death of Florence Kate Poysden. At this stage, the court did not move directly toward a trial on the facts of the killing. Instead, attention turned to a preliminary legal question: whether Charles Walter was fit to plead. This determination was required before any plea could be entered or evidence relating to guilt considered. As a result, the focus of the hearing shifted away from the circumstances of the crime itself and toward the condition of the accused. Medical evidence was introduced for this limited purpose. The court heard testimony concerning Walter's mental state, both at the time of the offence and at the time of the assizes. Among the witnesses called was Dr. Francis Davies, identified in contemporary reporting as a medical superintendent associated with the county asylum at Barming Heath. Dr. Davies presented his professional observations to the court. His testimony addressed Walter's mental capacity, drawing on examination and known medical history. Reference was made to family history, including the confinement of a close relative, and to symptoms observed in Walter that, in the doctor's opinion, affected his ability to understand the proceedings or properly instruct a defense. This evidence was not offered to excuse or explain the act itself. Its sole purpose was to assist the court in deciding whether Walter possessed the legal competence required to stand trial. No witnesses were called to contest the medical opinion, and no argument was advanced beyond the scope of the question before the court. At the close of the evidence, the judge directed the jury on their duty. The matter before them was not guilt or innocence, but fitness to plead. The jury was then asked to retire and consider that single question. After consideration of the medical evidence presented at the Maidstone Assizes, the jury returned with their finding. Their decision addressed only the narrow question put before them by the court. Charles Walter was found not fit to plead. The verdict was delivered formally and without elaboration. Under the law as it stood, a finding of unfitness meant that no plea could be taken and no trial on the charge could proceed. The court therefore did not hear evidence relating to guilt, nor was any verdict returned on the act itself. Following the jury's determination, the judge issued the required order. Charles Walter was to be detained during Her Majesty's pleasure, the statutory form of confinement applied in cases where an accused person was found incapable of standing trial due to mental condition. This order placed him under Crown authority for an indefinite period, subject to future administrative review rather than judicial sentence. No term of imprisonment was fixed, and no punishment was pronounced. The court's role concluded with the issuance of the detention order. Responsibility for Walter's custody passed from the criminal courts to the system governing criminal lunatics, where decisions regarding confinement and supervision were managed outside the ordinary sentencing framework. Walter was then removed from court custody and transferred according to the terms of the order. Contemporary records do not describe any further proceedings in open court, nor do they record any appeal or subsequent legal challenge. With that ruling, the criminal process reached its conclusion. There would be no jury trial, no examination of evidence relating to the killing, and no verdict of guilty or not guilty entered into the record. The case ended, not with a sentence, but with detention imposed by law. No trial followed. No sentence was passed. Following the conclusion of court proceedings, Florence Kate Poysden was laid to rest in Tainham, the village where she had lived her entire life. Parish burial records confirm her interment, and her grave was marked with a headstone erected by her family. The inscriptio, N, identifies her as the daughter of George and Anne Poysden and records her age at death. It includes a scriptural passage commonly used in the period, offering no commentary beyond faith and remembrance. No further judicial action followed the ruling at Maidstone. With Charles Walter detained under the order of the Crown, the criminal courts recorded no trial, no sentence, and no subsequent hearings connected to the case. The legal file closed without resolution in the conventional sense, leaving no verdict on the charge itself. What remains of the case survives entirely through documentation. Contemporary newspaper reports preserve accounts of the killing, the inquest, and the assizes proceedings. Court records record the formal steps taken and the legal outcome. Parish registers record a burial and a name. Together, these fragments form the complete public trace of Florence Kate Poysden's life and death. There are no surviving personal letters, diaries, or statements attributed to Florence herself. Her presence in the historical record exists only in relation to the event that ended her life and the proceedings that followed. Beyond that, the documents fall silent. The case does not offer closure in the way a trial or sentence might have done. It provides only what the records allow. The case does not end in resolution, it ends in record.